All right, so here we go. Okay, so as y'all know, I was busy this week during spring break giving lots of feedback to y'all for both classes that you have with me. So what I wanted to start with is your Self of the Therapist papers. So some of you had grades weeks ago, others of you got grades a couple of days ago. So I just wanted to, I very much appreciated what I read, and I noticed some themes in terms of y'all's thoughts, beliefs around substance use with the factor of legality being in that. So very interesting to me, also very unsurprising, because I think the war on drugs, as I've said, the messaging is strong. Whoever their marketing or PR person was, they deserve several jobs for their efficacy. So I wanted to talk to you about a research study that looked at, I want to say maybe like a dozen, we'll see in the next slide, several substances. So as we know, all substances of abuse have a medical application. So just keeping that in mind, and please along the way, if y'all have any comments, questions, raise your hand, share. So when these individuals took several factors into consideration on the harm when they were evaluating several of these substances. So the two like main areas that they looked at in terms of harm was harm to others, or harm to the person who was using the substance, and harm to others while they were under the influence of that substance. So then the like smaller aspects to users was any physical harm, psychological harm, and social harm. And then to others was physical and psychological harm and social harm. So as they broke this down even further, they came up with the areas of evaluation for the harm of these substances. So you can see here, drug-specific mortality, drug-related mortality, all of these are defined in the next slide. This was a study done in 2010, but to me, it being 12 years old isn't necessarily super outdated, or 12 years old, I guess I should say at this point. But I just wanted to break down for you what they were evaluating in terms of harm to the user and harm to others. So as I said, each of these, the evaluation criteria and the definitions for each are here. So if you want to look at things like, what do they mean by crime? What do they mean by environmental damage? And then here's what they found. So what is it? 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 12, 14, 16, 18, 20 substances. And the most dangerous substance through these multiple evaluation criteria was a legal substance. With alcohol, so you can see here, the red indicates harm to others. So what happens when that person is under the influence, and then harm to themselves. So again, physical, psychological, and social consequences or harm. So alcohol and tobacco, you know, in the top 6 of 20, and you know, several of the Schedule 1 drugs, which I'll talk to you about in subsequent slides, they're the least harmful based on these overall scores. So I just say that because when I was introduced to this study, I found it incredibly interesting how we still kind of place this, well, if it's legal, there must be a valid reason as to that's not just politically based, or not just based in capitalism, or, you know, the benefit of lobby groups or companies or something like that. So, and as you can see, this is significantly, like, look, it's a score of 72 for alcohol, which is nearly 20 points based on this scale of evaluation more harmful than heroin, which many of you indicated as kind of like, if I'm gonna kind of rate substances, or like a substance that I may have more of like a negative bias toward, it's probably going to be heroin. So for what it's worth, any comments or questions, reactions to any of this? Yeah, Jocelyn. And then I don't know who the second or third person who raised it.
Would some of that have to do with like the way and like where and when somebody uses? Because alcoholism is something that you can have in a wide range of places, not just at home, but like at a bar or at a club. So you have more spaces, kind of more opportunity to harm self and harm others.
I don't think so. Because I mean, quite frankly, you could be using heroin at the bar. You could be using cocaine at the bar. Or in other places, you would just have to do it much more discreetly than you do alcohol.
Okay, I see. Thank you.
Yeah, sure. Carla.
I just thought it was a self-therapist moment to understand that when I saw where ecstasy lied and where mushrooms lied and where cannabis lies, I'm like, oh, okay, so ecstasy is less harmful to others and yourself and I always was, I always thought it was the other way around. So that was quite interesting, but also it like helps like open up my mind to understand that not just because people have a negative narrative when it comes to certain substances, instead of others, that, that it's the truth. And it's why it's important to have education and research done on that before like actually speaking about it. So I thought that was really interesting.
Thank you, Carla. Harley.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting to see all the substances laid out that way. Something I was curious about, like I feel like one of the main scripts of like the war on drugs is that like heroin is so addictive that you do it one time and you're hooked forever. And I'm curious if they're like, what is true about the addictiveness of some of these substances?
Yeah, great question, because I am even looking like when I was, as I was reading y'all's Self the Therapist, I went down rabbit holes of like, okay, how did we, like, what is the rationale behind the scheduling? What evidence is there to support, like what scientific evidence is there to support the justification for how we have scheduled these substances and how we have rated the addictive nature of these? And quite frankly, so I don't have a like super well educated answer to your question, Harley, but I have like an adjacent answer of, so the risk in heroin or in opioids is that your tolerance rises very quickly with it. So if you take any amount of time off of using the substance, usually what happens is you go back to the same amount that you did prior to any time of abstinence. And that's where the overdose potential is very high. So your tolerance rises very quickly and lowers very quickly. Mm-hmm. So the addictive nature, I don't know, is much different than any other substance, but the physiological tolerance to it is quite different than other substances in terms of its lethality. When you use a lot of it, or the same amount that you used to when your body no longer has that tolerance. Yeah. But we also have very effective, which again, it's like if it's there, if somebody happens to be aware to use it, very effective rescue medications for that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's really interesting. We were talking, I actually was just listening to a podcast about like someone who was prescribed benzos by a psychiatrist and basically like the withdrawal process of trying to get off of those. And anyway, it just gets me thinking that there are a lot of legal substances that are also highly addictive and very hard to get off.
Which conflates the narrative, right? So it's almost, I also think of even how we talk about different alcohol, like a malt beverage a 40-ounce malt beverage versus a glass of Cabernet. You know, like there's the exact same chemical molecule, but we associate that with very different people and look at them very differently. And like that to me is an important factor in how, like, so as in our role as therapists, to be very aware of like, what have we internalized about that? What are our thoughts on that? And to not feel any sort of shame or anything around that, but just to be aware. So my sincere hope in like the feedback that I give you on the self of the therapist is a sincere posture of curiosity. But of course, if y'all said anything that was problematic, I promise to call it out, because that's also the purpose of graduate school too, is to say, hey, I think you've internalized something that could hurt people. I don't think I was that forceful with anyone in the class, but I don't think I needed to be. So anyway, that's my adjacent answer to you, Harley. Thank you. Piola.
In terms of harm to others, what does that truly mean? Like emotionally, physically, financially, or like everything?
Girl, it's in the PowerPoint. Let me show you.
Oh, okay.
So when they conceptualize that, so here, harm to others. So physical and psychological was injury, and then social, crime, environmental, family adversities, international damage, economic cost, and community. So from injury to community was how they conceptualized to others. So you can see it's injury here, and then all of this is how they went about defining what harm to others meant.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, of course. Joby.
Trying to like frame the question properly.
Sure.
So because alcohol is legal and it's one of the more commonly used substances because it's legal, isn't it going to inherently like affect the results of the study? So like for instance, something like with shrooms, it's not as readily available. So we can't assess harm in the same way. For instance, like it's not that common that someone's going to be high off of shrooms and then driving. Does that make any sense? Like I'm trying to assess whether because alcohol is a legal substance, it's going to evidently have an impact on the results of the study.
I mean, access to it possibly, but that also doesn't negate the harm that came from evaluating it as a substance. So what I'm hearing you say is the accessibility, the kind of acceptance, the potential like N of people who use this substance, does that affect the results of this study? I would say probably. I don't know. They also weighted harm to others. Let me see here. Oops. They weighted harm to users a little bit less than they weighted harm to others. So they, and again, it was a harm to others was weighted at 54, harm to users was weighted at 46. And I'm not exactly, I'd have to dive a little bit deeper into the like the actual article to tell you why that was weighted that way. But yeah, I'm confident that that's a factor in terms of the widespreadness of the use, which inherently, so does that, so the question is, you know, what role does that play? And all things being equal in terms of accessibility and use, would that change the results of anything? Given that it's nearly 20 points more harmful than heroin, like, I don't know that it would necessarily bring that number down. I don't know, but great question. And I'm sure that plays a role. Christiana.
My original thought was going to be something similar to Joby's question, but I also, just to clarify, when I was asking in the chat, when you were talking about tolerances and that they get high and then, or like the overdose potential, what drug were you talking about? I just didn't catch that. Was it heroin?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. I wanted to make sure I had that right. Thanks.
Yeah, of course. And so I wasn't sure if you were talking about if tolerance was a factor when they schedule drugs, and it's not.
I wasn't asking that stuff. They're really good to know.
Yeah. Any other thoughts? Or, I appreciate the critical thinking around, what do the statistics tell us? Are they telling us the whole story? What might be askew to this? All right. So we'll keep.
Sorry,
Oh,
I just think it's so interesting in terms of just specifically, I think looking at cannabis, because that is, I believe, the most recently legalized. And maybe because I just went to a Marijuana Anonymous meeting like last week, but I just think it's fascinating to look at like harm to users, because I feel like public perception is that that is not harmful because it's legal. So, I mean, or not as harmful. So yeah, it's just fascinating. Thank you for sharing.
yeah, of course. All right. So all of this brought me to also, again, I went down a rabbit hole, and I just wanted y'all to be, for those of you who are not familiar, I did also want you to be familiar with drug scheduling. So there's 5 schedules, and actually, so fun fact around my postdoc mentor who specializes in substance use, particularly nicotine, is that they proposed, I think, 4 more schedules, again, with justification of like these should be substances that should be decriminalized or have more access. There is no scientific evidence to substantiate its current scheduling, and then quite frankly, different criteria for scheduling. So the placement of schedules, so it goes from Schedule 1 being like the worst, essentially, to Schedule 5 being like the lowest potential for abuse, the safest and lowest rate of dependence liability. So those are the 3 areas that they look for: potential for abuse, safety, and dependence liability. So if you see the Schedule 1 drugs, things like LSD, cannabis, ecstasy, psilocybin, heroin, peyote, these are almost exclusively psychedelics or hallucinogens, which, as you can see from this chart, they hang out at the bottom here. The abuse liability, the scientific evidence that we have, for example, so I'm definitely not advocating for everyone going out and like just using drugs, because the way that we schedule them is all messed up. That the potential for abuse and the dependence liability is consistently shown to be very low. One person, and I know that this is kind of, what's the word I'm looking for? Anecdotal, is there's an individual who is, he researches hallucinogens and psychedelics, classic psychedelics, and has said in his 30 years, as a therapist and as a individual working in addiction, he has never in his 30 years had someone come in and say, I cannot stop using psilocybin. I just can't stop using LSD. That the abuse potential, the dependence liability is very low. So it just, to me, calls to question how we have come to this. We know some of the history with Schedule 1. So marijuana, for example, that's quite frankly racially motivated in terms of how it got here on Schedule 1, as we learned in 13th. Same deal with cocaine. It's because it's well, anyway, and then quite frankly, it is large. So marijuana stays here with large help from pharmaceutical companies. Pharmaceutical companies have really strong lobby groups. They are in the pockets of many politicians who make the laws that we have to abide by. So basically so just again, I hope I'm not sounding like a, conspiracy theorist, or like I'm kind of off my rocker here a little bit, of marijuana. Cannabis is a plant. You can't patent a plant. What you have to do is you have to pull out or synthesize an active ingredient from the plant in order to market that or to own a patent. So that's very difficult to do here, because essentially it's kind of in the government bank. THC is in the government bank because you can't patent a plant. So pharmaceutical companies are like, well, shit, this is like and it helps with anxiety. It can help with all of these presenting issues that we have made billions of dollars pushing a pill that individuals have to take every day. And then what they're finding through lots of research with psychedelics is that would change the treatment paradigm with many of the presenting issues. Like, so again, with depression, what do? We take a medication every single day. Who does that benefit? People at pharmaceutical companies, big wigs at pharmaceutical companies, stockholders of pharmaceutical companies. And the treatment paradigm for psychedelics is it's a one-time deal. That's a potential, like, I think back in 2016, when there was starting to be that movement toward decriminalization and legalization of cannabis, it was projected that pharmaceutical companies were going to lose billions of dollars in profit with the decriminalization and legalization of marijuana. So it's just a lot of this, to me, it's so frustrating because it's not grounded in science. And so, like, look at Schedule II. Again, these are chemicals that have high potential for abuse, the use potentially leading to severe psychological and physical dependence. Methadone is here. We have methadone clinics, but you have to use it supervised. We know that this is something very helpful in the treatment of several addictions. So, like, why is it here? I have questions about the rationale behind these decisions. So that's my soapbox. Yes, Harley.
I agree with you, but I'm curious if there is a lot of research on pharmaceutical companies kind of funding anti-psychedelic or anti-drug
Yes.
campaigns.
Yeah, that's pretty well documented.
Okay, cool.
Yeah, millions and hundreds of millions of dollars contributed toward anti-legalization, anti-decriminalization bills. Leanna.
Just for my notes. So I think I might have gotten this backwards. So it says that Schedule I is the worst in terms of abuse.
Yes.
But you said that the potential for abuse / dependence liability is low, correct?
Yes.
For these.
Correct.
Okay.
For hallucinogens, for psychedelics.
Okay.
Even so, that's what I'm saying, is it flies in the face of the criteria to be Schedule I. There's no scientific evidence to support it being scheduled that high.
Okay.
By the criteria of potential for abuse and dependence liability. And quite frankly, they're very safe. I showed y'all of those 20 substances, they're in the bottom 6 of that, with significantly lower numbers. So it begs the question, how did they get there? I don't think it was through scientific evidence.
Thank you.
Yeah. Did someone else have their hand up and maybe put it down? Okay, I think that's all my soapbox tonight. And again, I don't know. I'm advocating for accurate information about substances and their harm. And then, like I said, it's informed by some of the feedback or some of the things that I read in Yourself with a Therapist of how we just naturally connect legal with safe or legal with more acceptable. And really the question is why? Like, why are they legal? Why are some things illegal? What are the metrics that we're using? And my thought is that they're inequitably applied. So that's that. All right. Where are we going? There we go. So I just thought this was kind of funny. Oh, that happen to my bad. So the catch-22 of it's on Schedule 1 because there's no accepted medical use, and the research and development is saying you can't investigate its medical use. It's a Schedule 1 drug. So the question is always, how do we move it from there? Because the DEA is saying this thing that is affecting R&D. So it's like kind of this never-ending cycle of keeping it there because we can't research its efficacy because we're not able to get a hold of it. Okay, so moving to our readings. So we're going to cover tonight the Family Matters program. So largely what hopefully one of the takeaways that you had from the readings this week is around personal accountability. So as we know, as systems thinkers, as people who, conceptualize issues systemically, that by now, hopefully you are not looking at the individual who is struggling with addiction in a vacuum, that there's a whole system of people that are likely maintaining some of these dynamics that either are exacerbating the use, maintaining the use, kind of contributing to the use. But really in terms of this program is having people within the family recognize that they really only have kind of power over themselves. So the goal with the Family Matters program is for individuals who are family members of those who are addicted to change themselves. So if I'm the daughter, I'm addicted, that my mom, dad, and sister are not waiting for me to change before they do something that's the change happens there in terms of things like boundaries, dynamics, communication, all of that kind of stuff. And those are unique to the family's needs. So they're changing for themselves so that their lives will work better and to create a family system that encourages and supports recovery. Because as we know, family is one of the main kind of culprits for maintaining use because they're not really aware of their role. So we covered a lot of Bowen family systems, so hearkening back to last semester. And so Bowen Family Systems, as you know, is modern, much more directive in its approach. So that's the thought with any sort of addiction treatment, is to be quite directive. And I know MI, motivational interviewing, and we'll cover that in more in depth in a couple of weeks. That's inherently a little bit more, it's not necessarily indirect, but it's a little bit more collaborative than modern approaches like Bowen Family Systems theory. So the Family Matters model takes Bowen Family Systems and the 12 steps and connects them, integrates them into 6 different modules. So again, just having you think about how could I incorporate a 12-step program or the principles of the 12 steps. And again, they don't have to be integrated, but this is I think a good model when we talk about integration of how 2 approaches can really complement and work together with one another. Okay, so the first module is an introduction to a new way of thinking about family. So as we know in Bowen, 3 of the 8 foundational concepts in Bowen are differentiation. That's probably the heaviest hitter, emotional triangles, and the emotional process of families. So with this, there is quite a bit of psychoeducation around, what is differentiation, what are emotional triangles, and what is the emotional process of families, and what are their role in addiction. So as there's conversation around differentiation, learning about that, we're pulling in step 1. So how does step 1 connect to that in admitting that we are powerless over the substance or substances and that our lives have become unmanageable? So the thought is, again, that these concepts of differentiation, the emotional triangles, they are relational dynamics that maintain and I guess sustain addiction. So that's what's covered in the first module. If you have any questions, feel free to raise your hand, or any comments as you, anything that came up for you as you were reading. So again, this is focused on the family members of the individual who is struggling with addiction. So the second is choosing life. So again, the differentiation, if you remember, differentiation essentially has two angles. There is differentiation in terms of relational differentiation. So that autonomy, so that separateness, that sense of self, also in balance with connection. So it's a balance between autonomy and connectedness. And differentiation is kind of finding that sweet spot of still being able to be myself, have my own beliefs, have my own morals and values, while like having my own voice, while feeling that I have meaningful connections with others. And then the differentiation of self is the balance between emotion and essentially like intellect or logic, which has been critiqued as being inherently sexist, which I don't necessarily disagree with, but it is a bringing in like kind of a slowing down of that automatic reaction process. So when we, sometimes the theory is that when we are reacting out of an emotional space, that's exactly what we're doing. We're reacting. Whereas when we're pulling in a little bit more of our prefrontal cortex, when we're pulling in a little bit more of that intellect or logic, that we're more so in control and able to respond. So it's not saying that emotions are bad or that logic is good. It's saying that we need both of these. And if we're functioning solely out of one or the other, because if we're functioning out of solely logic, that can be pretty disconnecting. If we're functioning out of solely emotion, that can be pretty destructive, where that can have some enmeshment that can lead to some emotional cutoff or contribute to some emotional cutoff that can really heighten anxiety, which we know promotes emotional triangles and that kind of stuff. So there's space for both of them. There has to be that balance both ways. So with changing life, from a Bowen perspective, you're focusing on the family members, essentially taking an I position, taking some accountability, having some differentiation, and not waiting for the individual struggling with addiction to change before they do anything. So when you are taking a position, so as we know in Bowen, this is that essentially that I position, or it's it is in here kind of juxtaposed with ultimatum. So as we know, ultimatums are very other focused. Like, I will do this or if you don't do this, this is how I will react. So it's very, the power and control lies in the other person. So it's like a quid pro quo kind of a thing. And then taking a position is, regardless of how you respond to this thing that I'm doing, I'm going to stand firm in that. So it's self-focused and grounded in your own values and principles. One of the things that, when challenged or when it's brought to their attention, family members realize that the ways in which they are acting in their family system really are contrary to their own values and principles. As they're maybe like in a position of enabling, in a position of denial, that when they really take an inventory of their own values and principles, how they're acting is incongruent with that. And that can be really disconcerting. That can be like really distressing for individuals. So in order to kind of understand, so again, some of the transgenerational influences of this, while you're in the second module of the Family Matters program, you're constructing genograms to understand, how has conflict been managed, addressed, or not in your family of origin, in your parents' family of origin? What are the messages around conflict? What are the messages around addiction? What are gender roles? What are cultural norms? What has been passed down through generations that inform the way in which you are acting and navigating your own relationships in your family of origin or your nuclear family? So then in this, the complement or the 12-step piece that is brought in is the second step of, you came to believe that a power greater than yourselves can restore us to sanity. And the third step of, we make a decision to turn our will and our lives over to the care of God as we understand God. So I just capitalized things as they were capitalized in the text. So just letting you know. And remember, I know one of the critiques of the 12-step is like, what if you are not religious? And as we know, spirituality is a big piece of that. So really is that lives over to the care of God as we understood God. These are all in past tense because the thought is that you are working through or have worked these steps. So just semantics in terms of understanding how spirituality is very individualized, and there's room for that individualization in the 12-step program. All right, so then module 3, a wide angle lens. So in terms of Bowen, and I'll stop the share here for a second so we can kind of talk a little bit about how much we relate to these different relationship patterns. So discussion of like pretty common relationship patterns, period, but that can really be highlighted or accentuated when there is addiction within the family. So the role of triangles. So again, as we know, Bowen's theory is that a unit of 3 is kind of the smallest stable unit within a family. So triangles are not inherently bad. The problem happens when they occur long term, and it's a way of kind of avoiding or skirting whatever reason the triangle has been created in the first place. So the thought is, you talk person to person. If the conflict is with 2 people, that you deal with it within those 2 people. What we tend to do in families is pull in a third person so we don't have to directly address that conflict between the 2 people. So understanding the role of anxiety in creating triangles and how triangles they function to lower the anxiety or distract from conflict temporarily. That's the problem with triangles. One of the problems with triangles. So there are 2 or 3 identified pretty common relational patterns or relational dynamics, which is the pursuer distancer, the overfunctioner and underfunctioner, and the conflict cutoff. So I will 100% own that I am a pursuer. I am an overfunctioner. I'm the one that is very interested in conflict. So I'm curious so the pursuer distancer, so that's when 2 people are in conflict and one person's like, give me space, I need some time. And another person is like, I am so anxious, we have to deal with this right now. So it's like, I imagine it almost as if like a toddler, and again, you can probably hear some of my biases, but I promise I'm a pursuer, of like a toddler chasing around their parent. I'm like, no, give me attention. The parent's like, just give me some space. So I don't want to make it sound like it's a hierarchy like that. These are 2 equals in terms of chronological age or development, but one person has it creates so much anxiety to have that space of not having closure, or I guess I would say more like resolution with a conflict. And then it creates so much anxiety in the pursuer to have that closeness or to feel kind of coerced into having that conversation. So what happens is as the person pursues, the withdrawer withdraws more, and then that exacerbates the dynamic. So the second is the overfunctioner, underfunctioner, where one person essentially kind of learns. So I'll use a really simple example here of like, because I'm probably using inappropriate developmental things, but I always think of like a teenager as kind of an underfunctioner, a parent as an overfunctioner. Of the teenager kind of learns, like if I just kind of show some ineptitude, then this will be done for me. So if I show that I don't clean my room, my parent will come in and do that for me. So it ultimately, the overfunctioner builds resentment of feeling as though they're inequitably contributing to the household or contributing emotionally to the relationship. And then the underfunctioner generally feels like infantilized or juvenilized, of not feeling as though they have permission to express themselves, or that whatever they contribute won't be respected. And then the conflict cutoff is essentially when same issue with emotional cutoff, or same concept with emotional cutoff with Bowen of when intensity gets so high. So remember, a cutoff doesn't mean that there's no emotional connection. That is an indicator of emotional connection. However, that's also an indicator of long-term anxiety, long-term stress, where the cutoff is the only way that the individual can think of to relieve the stress. Oh, I am? Am I cutting out? Oh, Oh, okay, maybe that was just the person cutting out. Got it. So I'm curious of when I talked to you or when you read about these 3 different relational dynamics, if you relate to or resonate with any of those, and like if it was in your family of origin, if it's in your nuclear family, for those of you who have kind of moved out of your family of origin and kind of creating your own family. Yeah, what do you relate to, Christiana?
Oh, I just think it was funny reading because I've known my husband for like 21 years, which sounds crazy. We've been married for 13, I guess, and together off and on for I don't know how long, but we've been together a long time. So throughout the years, I realized like the pursuer, what was it? What was the other? I'm blanking.
Distancer. It's
Yeah.
pursue, withdraw, pursue, distance.
So I think I would typically be the pursuer, but in the more like the last few years, it's been kind of funny because he's become more like, sometimes I'm like, no, I need some space basically when we're talking about something. So I'm realizing that, you know, the longer you're in a relationship with someone, you know, you realize more about them and more about you. And
Sure.
I was like, we just need to take a pause because this is going nowhere, whatever we're talking about. I can tell this is just going to escalate or
Mhm.
whatever. Maybe I'm just not in the headspace to talk about it. And so now when I distance, like he is totally the pursuer. And
Sure.
it's just interesting because I never would have expected that from him. But now it's like, and I think it's because it's like you have to have that, almost like you get so used to that dynamic that if one person's doing one thing, then the other person is like, wait, now you're doing my role, now I have to do your role. Or like same with over functioning, you know,
Yeah.
or whatever. It's like if one of us is really busy or like he travels for work a lot, and so like if he's gone, I have to be like the over functioner over here. And then sometimes when he gets back, I'm like, oh, I need a break. And then he has to, you know, like, but I don't see that part as like an unhealthy type thing. I just thought the pursuer distancer thing was kind of funny that he ended up, whenever I like distance, then he is the pursuer.
Sure. So from a cybernetic standpoint, what are 2 concepts that you touched on? And this is open to the whole class. So when Christiana said, I typically or historically have been the pursuer. Now that I am in the distancer role, my husband assumes the pursuer role. Like in cybernetics, does that term or does that concept make sense to everybody? What was Christiana alluding to? What's that?
I said, would it be homeostasis? Like
Homeostasis and yes, beautiful. So Joby, it's a negative feedback loop. Remember, a negative feedback loop is what maintains homeostasis. It's trying to decrease change. Positive feedback loop is what amplifies change. But you are on the right track. Great.
There's also something called a burnout pursuer. I don't know if you guys have learned about that, but it's when the pursuer pursues for so long that they get burnt out. And then when they burn out from so many attempts, then that's sometimes where the withdrawer will also then pick up more of a pursuer role.
Yeah, from a behavioral theory, that's an extinction burst. Yeah, thank you. Leanna.
Oh, well, I was, I mean, I could share, but I was more curious about if some of these lead into other ones. So like, I know for in my life, my family of origin, because they're the main people that I really care about, I'm a pursuer. But with my husband's family, I was a distancer. Just culturally, that was just you don't pick fights, you stay respectful, but it's led into cutoff. So I'm curious if like some of these lead into another, or if you can be multiple in multiple areas of your life. Yeah, just a little bit more info about you know, maybe duality.
Sure. Camelia, do you have anything? I saw you nodding. I didn't know if you had any thoughts on it.
Yeah, you could definitely be have different roles in different relationships. Typically, so being a pursuer, being a withdrawer is like almost like a defense mechanism. So you do have a tendency to lean more towards one or the other, but yeah, you can definitely have different roles. Like one example would be that typically kids are the withdrawer in the parent-child relationship, but maybe in intimate relationships, they're the pursuer.
And in terms of like so I heard you say the pursuer withdrawer, like, does that contribute to maybe something like conflict cutoff, that dynamic? So they're very parallel. So if you think of like a pursuer, that's usually somebody who kind of like, well, like it's like the presence of conflict probably indicates at least they care, right? So if you're going to engage, I don't really care if it's positive or negative, but if you're going to engage with me, that means at least I influence you, at least you're affected by me, and I'll take it. So it's like that reinforcement. And then the withdraw and the cutoff, as you can see, they're pretty similar, of like just moving away. But again, withdraw and cutoff doesn't indicate not being emotionally connected or not being emotionally affected. It's just the way in which the person deals with that emotion. So it's basically saying, this is too much. I don't know how to respond to this. I feel stuck. I feel trapped. I feel suffocated. I need to move away from this. So it's kind of like Horney's moving against, moving toward, moving away. Like there's so many theories of communication and relational interactions that kind of overlap with one another. So I would say that these are probably like very similar kind of parallel processes. Any other thoughts on these different relational patterns or relational dynamics? All right, let's keep rocking, y'all. So, and then again, in terms of integration into the 12 steps and what would be covered as you're talking about relational patterns, is covering steps 4 and 5, which I will tell you are historically, and I guess like maybe not historically, these are pretty well documented to be 2 of the most difficult steps in the 12 steps, because it's about looking at yourself and how you have harmed others, how you have harmed yourself, how you've compromised relationships, how you've compromised maybe your personal integrity. You're getting more, you're becoming more aware of like your own personal values and morals, and how maybe as you were in your addiction, you were really incongruent with that. So made a searching and fearless moral inventory of ourselves. So having that introspection. So remember, if you think of like the kind of the function of something like substance use, it's to not think about this kind of stuff. So you go from potentially years and years of non-practice or never practicing, having negative affect and using to kind of escape from that affect, to saying like, all right, now we're going to take a deep dive into you and how you've acted and how you've interacted, how you've harmed others, how you've hurt others. And that's a really difficult step. And then the second is that you actually go to these individuals who you have identified as people who you've harmed, and you apologize without the expectation that you're forgiven. And that's really like, just think about that level of vulnerability of going to potentially an inventory of, 20 people to say, here's people throughout my life, throughout my addiction that I've hurt. And I'm going to go to every single one of them that I can and say, here's what I recognize I did. And so that is inherently incredibly vulnerable, which essentially flies in the face of the functionality of addiction. The purpose of that is to wear a mask, is to separate, is to move away from, so you don't deal with this kind of stuff. So I just, to me, these are incredibly brave, incredibly difficult steps to move through. And these tend to take the longest time. So in AA or any sort of, kind of mutual aid, not like anonymous, whatever it is, NAAA, whatever, that anybody who like moves through these 2 steps very quickly, generally with their sponsors are like, slow down. You're really trying to expedite this process. It's not an expeditable, if that's a word, process. So these 2 steps can take a very long time, and it's meant to be, it's just inherently very difficult. So module 4 is shifting focus. So again, when you think of a family system that has an individual or individuals with addiction, the focus of the family is generally on that individual or those individuals. So taking an I position is a 180-degree flip from where the family is generally positioned, of, you know, kind of letting the chips fall, creating some distance, having the focus not be on that, which I think we talked about last week, of, you know, thinking about a couple who has a child with an addiction. And then when that child enters into recovery, that's a real risky time for separation and divorce within that couple, because they've been so focused on a third party that they haven't attended to that relationship. Or you find that people kind of decompensate when someone starts to heal and enter into recovery, that they become symptomatic, that they have some problems, because again, they don't have kind of that, I guess, for lack of a better term, kind of that focus or that distraction of all of the things that they've been neglecting within themselves. So taking an I position is something that, like I said, families where there's an individual with addiction, they just don't do. Which is like we talked about, for those of you who, you know, jogging your memory, of talking from a first person, speaking for yourself, focusing on yourself. Again, this is likely that kind of half of the differentiation of that individuation that has probably really been neglected, because what we know is with families where a member has an addiction, generally the boundaries and the family dynamics are pretty enmeshed, pretty diffuse boundaries. So then in this shifting of focus, we're looking at steps 6 and 7 of the 12 steps of, we are ready to have God remove all these defects of character. And then we humbly ask God to remove our shortcomings. So again, this is kind of in line with that sense of powerlessness, of recognizing. So again, remembering that AANA, these are abstinence-based models. So the belief in harm reduction really isn't there, that there is a complete abstinence from whatever substance or activity, behavior that you've been engaging in to kind of cope. Then the 5th module is investing in sobriety. So from Bowen, understanding reacting out of anxiety as opposed to responding, and primary and secondary emotional cutoffs. Can anybody tell us what is the difference between primary and secondary emotional cutoffs? Or you want to take a guess? Let's try. Let's take some risks. Secondary and primary emotional cutoffs.
I'll take a guess.
Yes, thank you, Sarah.
So I think primary cutoff would be like, if like I'm gonna make this up, like if I cut off like my brother, and then, but a secondary cutoff would be like if I like also cut off his wife, like.
Yep. Sure. So yes, that's fair. So a primary cutoff is directly between two people. It's kind of like the generation where it started. So
Yeah.
Secondary cutoffs tend to be cross generation. So like if your brother had a son or a daughter, a child,
I see.
that
Okay.
would be the secondary cutoff, because it had nothing to do directly with that child.
Okay.
But they are feeling the effects of that cutoff between the two of you.
Yeah.
So that
okay.
usually happens with like extended family, or like I've never met my grandparents because my parent doesn't have a good relationship with them. That's a secondary cutoff.
I see.
But I think yours still works even within the same generation of nothing really happened between you and his wife directly.
Yeah.
So he's just kind of feeling the effects of that cutoff between you
Yeah,
and
that's what I kind of meant. Like has nothing to do with her, but
Correct.
but she gets cut off in the act of it. Like, so, but yours makes more sense. Thank you.
But I think it still applies. It just literally is a like non-participating person who is feeling the effects of a primary cutoff. Thank you, Sarah. See, beautiful. Okay, so here I made this comment about it being controversial. So particularly with any of my students who are part of the LGBTQIA community so what Bowen promotes is mending cutoffs, bridging these emotional cutoffs. So if, for example, there's a secondary cutoff between like you and your aunt, that the thought is that because you're so kind of centralized or saturated within your family of origin, that fosters a lot of anxiety because you're essentially cut off from any other outlet and quite frankly, any other contextual information. So like, your mom's sister might have some pretty helpful information about why your mom is the way she is. But because you don't have that connection, you don't know. So you're kind of left to your own devices of just being frustrated with your mom. So in Bowen's approach, the thought is the more connections that you make within your family, the better, because it essentially diffuses the anxiety so that you can make these one-to-one connections with other family members. So that also means primary cutoffs. And so one pieces of feedback, so I'm open to, I definitely want to engage in a conversation if anybody has any thoughts around this of, having emotional cutoffs or cutoffs that are very purposeful in a family of origin. So for example, if an individual comes out and they are rejected by their family, or they have had very harmful interactions of saying like, I have no desire to reconnect. Quite frankly, I think that would be traumatizing to me and not helpful at all. So I say that it's controversial because I think that there are considerations. So if you are kind of blanketly saying, just reconnect with your family, that might be really incongruent or very dismissive of a pretty justified reason. And I say that, I know that that's my, like, if I say justified, that's my call. So it doesn't have to be justified to me, but like for a very valid reason as to why the cutoff has occurred. Does that make sense? And so I've had multiple students who are part of the LGBTQIA community go, wait, what does Bowen ask? No way. And so that's just, I know that that's not general, but that just happens to be the students that I've had experience with that say, don't like it. Carla.
I was just going to share that I actually ended up cutting my family because of comment. My best friend is lesbian, and they were angry at me for not disclosing my reasons for divorce and not really interacting with them. I went very private in that sense, and so they didn't understand that. And so they took it out on making comments about her and I always hanging out and traveling, and so it was very derogatory comments that they were making. So I cut them off because for me, it's someone who's helping me survive shouldn't be treated that way. And regardless if you're my family or not, that's disgusting behavior. So I cut them off, not because of me, but because of what they were causing me. And so, yeah, I could see how that could be very harmful, because you're asking me to rebuild relationships with people who bring a ton of toxic energy into my life rather than peace. So yeah, I would see why it would be controversial.
Sure. Thank you so much for sharing, Carla. And this also taking you, sticking with some of the family concept here. I know that when we talk about genograms and when we talk about family, that we tend to talk about biological. So it also is very important as you're building genograms, as you're doing any sort of family work, that you take into consideration any family members of choice, any family members of creation, like whatever the client denotes as their family, that they don't have to be blood relatives. And quite frankly, that, if you go and take into consideration things like adoption, it doesn't have to be who the family that they were raised with. It can be people who are very meaningful for that individual. So just to be very expansive and inclusive in how you conceptualize family is important. Okay, let's go ahead and take our first break. Let's come back together at 7:15. Keep rocking. All right, so I will go ahead and get started here. And as always, I can't see y'all. So if you have a question or comment or anything, please raise your hand, speak up. All right. So going back to module 5 of the Family Matters model. So again, being very aware of what are the contextual factors around any sort of emotional cutoff with your client, really getting an understanding of that. So you are not directing them or, encouraging them to do something that could be quite harmful for them. And then I was curious of anyone's thoughts as you were reading about this, of the note on communication, that it is possible to understand someone without agreeing with them. So I'm curious your thoughts on this, any experience you have with this, and I can share with you kind of a clinical story about this when I tried to facilitate some conversation between a couple. So it is possible to understand someone without agreeing with them. What do you think about that?
I think it's possible because I agree a lot with, I disagree a lot with people, but I understand where they're coming from. So for example, my uncle, when he expresses himself, like sometimes when he speaks, I'm like, I understand you. I don't agree with some of the things you say, but I understand where you're coming from. I think that's one of the hardest things that my mom doesn't know how to do, understand that outside of her perspective or her experiences, other people have their own experiences that have molded them. And although we may disagree on something, at the end of the day, I understand why you have that opinion.
Thank you so much. I was laughing because one of the jokes with my mom was that it was her way or the wrong way. Like the two options were the way she does it or a wrong way to do it.
That's a very mom.
Does anybody have any difficulty with that, or like anyone care to share, understanding and kind of agreement going hand in hand, or seeing that the two of them can be kind of mutually or simultaneously existing of understanding and disagreeing?
I think it depends on the person sometimes. I think some people are fully capable of doing that, understanding and not agreeing. And I think sometimes other people maybe aren't, but I also think it can depend on the situation and what they're disagreeing on. Because if it's like your core value, something that's really, like your core value, and somebody else doesn't agree with you, then it can be hard to possibly understand why they wouldn't agree with you. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and this really harkens to some of enmeshed family boundaries, right? Of this kind of vicarious experience of, if we don't agree, then that means that we're not connected. So this is a pretty common dynamic within families that are quite enmeshed or have very diffuse boundaries of either it's like we are all of the same mind, and somebody who steps out of that or thinks differently, that they're potentially scapegoated or blacklisted or, something like that, where if you're different in any way, we're going to just cut off from that, which again does not mean that they're not emotionally enmeshed or fused. Thank you, Christiana. Harley, did you have something?
Yeah, I guess kind of similar. I feel like from an intellectual perspective, I can say yes. And I kind of feel like everyone's always doing their best. And so there's definitely a reason why they are doing what they're doing. However, when you were like, what is the difficulty in that? I feel like it's more of like a felt thing, or like something that is like hard to control, that's not very logical. And I think that comes up in this conversation with loved ones, with family, where like with a stranger, I'm like, yeah, I can understand why you would do that. But when you know someone really well, I feel like it can feel really different.
Sure. Yeah. Thank you so much for that, which I think is if I may share, a good segue into a clinical experience I had. So is for anybody who is unfamiliar, there's an intervention in Imago relational therapy called intentional dialogue. which is essentially like a script that you give couples who are having a difficult time communicating, like a very structured way of talking to one another. So essentially what happens is it's like a 3-part formula where you have somebody who is sending the message and somebody who is receiving the message. So you essentially have a speaker and a listener, and the listener's job is really important, because we tend to, like, we have difficulty expressing ourselves, but I would argue that probably as a society, we have a more difficult time making space for listening for others. So it's this true listening for understanding and not a listening to respond. So the formula is that the speaker shares from an I perspective, like a conflict or a concern, or maybe some feedback for their partner. And in little snippets, they deliver essentially like one sentence at a time or one piece of information at a time. And then their partner will essentially parrot back or paraphrase to them. So what I'm hearing you say is this: did I get that right? Is there anything else? And then they go back and forth until the speaker feels like they have shared everything and that the listener has responded appropriately in terms of being accurate about what they're hearing. The next part of that is expressing understanding. And then the last part is empathy. So I had a couple where, and again, in retrospect, maybe I was moving a little too fast introducing them to this, but they were very volatile. They had a very difficult time communicating. So I really wanted to kind of bring them back to basics. And so the kind of script for understanding is, that makes sense to me because. So again, largely what happens is these are partners who are on completely different pages or have very almost potentially like, in contrast or contradicting perspectives about the same situation. So the speaker shares, and so because it's a very like kind of clunky, you're very heavy-handed as a therapist in like giving cues and encouraging. So a lot of times like they're sitting like looking at facing one another, and like as a therapist you're right here, but you still have them like, what do I do now? What do I do next? So when the understanding piece came, I set the cue of this makes sense to me because, and the partner goes, this makes sense to me because it doesn't. What am I supposed to do if it doesn't make sense? And it was rooted in disagreement. So just a demonstration of how, the goal or the expectation for this person was essentially that their partner would kind of like come to their side on it. So some of that differentiation between the two of them wasn't there, of either we agree on this or we're in conflict on this. There wasn't space for different perspectives. So I'll never forget it, because I literally sat there and went, I don't know. I think I was like a first year doc student or something. And I was like, I don't know what to do with this. I didn't anticipate you saying it doesn't make sense. So I don't remember how I handled it. Probably not great. So that's my story on agreeing and understanding. All right, back to the content. So in this, it is complemented by steps 8 and 9 of the 12 steps of you've made a list of all persons that you have harmed and became willing to make amends with all of them. So again, hearkening back to step 5, a little bit of a deeper dive into that, and then make direct amends to such people whenever possible, except when to do so would injure them or others. So again, steps 4, 5, and 9 are the most difficult. Oh, I'm sorry. So I was describing step 5 inaccurately. So this is essentially like a trusted other, most likely a sponsor. So steps 4 and 9 are where people have a very difficult time with actually going to the people that they have hurt, looked at this person in the eye, shared some vulnerability, because that person has the option to basically say F off. So again, very inherently vulnerable, something that the individual has likely been, avoiding or, not confronting for a very long time. So my apologies on the misinformation with that one. Okay, so finally, module 6 of moving forward. So with Bowen, you are rethinking default responses to threats to avoid functional collapse. So this is essentially like, bankruptcy, loss of employment, the inherent structure of your family, like that no one talks to anyone, that they move to different parts of the country. That's what they mean by functional collapse, reiterating how all members sustain the addiction. So again, this is as how we look at it, is this is a system issue. So the goal of lowering reactivity and remembering positive. So just to reiterate here, our brain has a tendency to remember negative experiences more poignantly than any sort of positive. So being very purposeful in noting sensations and having that like kind of positive talk when you're going through an experience is really important. So we're wired to remember our negative experiences. So if you find that, when you think back on a certain event that may have been kind of difficult, that you have a really difficult time noting any of the positives, that is how we're hardwired. So just to depathologize any of that. So our emotions are seated in our limbic system, which is also responsible for identifying any threats. So you'll do a much more deep dive on that into your trauma course. So just wanted to normalize that. So here there's a acronym, many of the approaches really like acronyms of have a positive experience, enrich it by attending to it and allowing yourself to be aware of how wonderful it is. So again, this is some mindfulness, bringing in some of that behavioral aspect, absorb it by allowing yourself this experience and the good feelings to sink into conscious awareness. So you are purposefully, thoughtfully focusing on what is happening that is joyful, enjoyable, positive. And then you can link it to any sort of negative thoughts or experience in order to help heal those painful memories. So this process is thought to be an antidote to the kind of flooded or overwhelming negative memory about this experience. So this could be like a revisiting of some sort, of maybe a place, some kind of re-experiencing and kind of rewriting that script, rewriting that narrative, maybe overriding a memory, something like that, or adapting, changing a memory in some way. And then this also covers steps 10 through 12 in this module of continue to take a personal inventory. So this is essentially continuing to, this would be akin to like continued self of the therapist work. So it's an attitude of like a willingness to inspect, a willingness to investigate and unpack, understand, why do I believe this? Where did I learn this? It's almost like asking yourself Socratic questioning. And then when you're wrong, or when you've harmed somebody, or when you've misstepped, to be willing and able to admit that, to acknowledge that. 11 is sought through prayer and meditation, again, whatever that is, and that's supposed to say God, not GPD, to improve our contact with God as we are understanding that God, praying for our knowledge of God's will for us and the power to carry that out. So again, that is the language of AA and NA and any anonymous. So this may be something where, you're having conversations with your client about its appropriateness and fit and any, needed adaptations to the language. Because again, I'm just thinking of individuals who have, potentially been harmed by the church, just kind of thinking through how this language may affect other people. So just being mindful of that, if this is something that you find utility in and something that you want to pull into your therapy, of being mindful of any sort of historical experiences in religion, in organized religion, I guess. And then having had a spiritual awakening as a result of these steps, we tried to carry this message to alcoholics and to practice these principles in all of our affairs. This is, kind of taking it back to our theories class of this is where some of that, community involvement is. of essentially kind of walking what in AA they say walking the walk of, you know, I've done all of this personal growth and now I'm going to essentially kind of spread this to others. So this is where, you know, you can become sponsors for others. You can be, you know, become politically involved, socially involved, you know, kind of making a difference for something now that you've kind of acknowledged some of your values and principles. And again, you've grown, you've evolved of how do you do things in your life that are congruent with the growth. All right, so let me stop this share and let me stop talking for a little bit. Any thoughts, questions? I know there's a couple chats. Oh, you're welcome, Piola. Any thoughts on the Family Matters model or anything that you want to bring to the larger group before we break up into breakout rooms to discuss these questions? All right, I'm going to go ahead. Oh, yep, go ahead, Julie.
I just had a question. Some of it, it totally made sense when I was reading the book in terms of the steps, the modules going along with the steps. Like I could envision a partner going through this and the other partner and kind of the wife as the example that they used in the books. But some of them didn't, I don't know, some of them seemed a little more clunky than others. Like the wide angle lens, I guess made sense because, okay, you're taking a step back, you're looking at the family, you're looking at all of these, but then other ones, I don't know, I struggle. Like step one, you really have to, I just think of the example of like the gentleman, I think it was in one of the vignettes that like still wasn't acknowledging that he had an issue or whatever with his drug paraphernalia, and he was blaming her. So, I mean, in that case, I guess, I don't know what my question is. I don't know if you have any thoughts.
You're seeing how they integrate pretty smoothly and other places where you're having a difficulty seeing how they align with one another.
Exactly.
Is that what I'm hearing?
Yes. And maybe it was in the first steps that it was kind of hard for me to see how it aligned.
Yeah. So to me, it's this like parallel experience of so the family members understanding their role in the maintenance, potentially creation of the addiction. You also have to have the individual who's addicted move out of denial. So it's like this group moving out of denial. So to admit that you are powerless to something is to say, I have a problem and this is something I need to change. And then to acknowledge the role of triangles, emotional fusion, differentiation is the family members also saying, hey, we're not innocent. You know, we're not immune to any of the contribution of what we have created as a family. So it's a parallel experience of saying like, there's something I want to change as in terms of my substance use and likely the way that I interact with my family, and the family saying, we see you, we're also going to make some changes because we recognize our role in this too.
That makes sense. That makes more sense.
You got it. Any other questions? All right. So for the next, let's say, I don't know, 20 minutes. I'm going to stop this recording. Welcome back, everyone. All right, I'll close these breakout rooms. So would you rather, by a show of hands, break right now or go through some of this for the next like 10 minutes and then take a break? So break right now. Oh, you guys want to just, oh. All right, I think you're outnumbered. We're going to stick around for 10 minutes. All right, so just checking in about question number 1, what you all discussed in your groups of the text reveals that most research on family therapy and addiction treatment has been done with adolescents. What do you think accounts for this? Bowen Family Systems Therapy or theory holds that the person who is motivated and is in a position of influence to change is the best person to work with in therapy. How might this be applied to research on adults and addiction treatment? What do y'all think? Christiana.
So for the first part in our group, we kind of wondered if the fact that parents would be probably the ones bringing in their teens to get treatment and sign up for the research, And we thought they might be more likely to do that for their teens than for like themselves as an adult. But we weren't really sure. We just had that as a theory.
Sure. What else?
Our group came up with, we think that for the first portion of the question, at least with adolescents, they're more forthcoming with information. And since it's adolescents, if they are struggling with substance use disorder, it's more acceptable as like someone who's an adolescent versus someone who's like an adult and they should have already been over this phase in their life. That's the way we saw it.
Okay. I like all the theories being generated here. Cool. Thank you. So what do y'all think about kind of the person that essentially holds the influence? So one of the things about, so I'm just thinking of like experiential versus Bowen, for example, of, Bowen's belief that essentially it takes one person to create kind of a chain of change. Whereas Whitaker said, I'm working with everyone or no one. And Bowen said like, all right, I'll work with one person that has influence and like, that'll probably kind of trickle to the rest of the system. So what do you guys think about that? Of if you're not getting, like, what are your thoughts around having the entire system and maybe having that be a parameter of working with you, as opposed to working with an influential piece of the system and then hoping that what is talked about or just like worked on in therapy is carried home? Yeah, Sarah.
So in our group, we kind of talked about how that you like, well, no, this is me. I believe that all therapy kind of has to have someone who is motivated. Like you kind of have to have somebody who wants to do the work. And with this model, I didn't realize until we reread it right now, like was kind of built upon the fact it was like adolescence research, and then it's going to be put onto adults. And I thought that that's kind of, it's odd because like the motivation of an adult and an adolescent, I think can be different. Sure. And so I don't know how that would structure the model very well, because like what entices an adult to want to get clean as opposed to like what a child wants to get clean. I don't know, but then I haven't spent that much time with people who are addicted, so I could be totally wrong. So,
So what I'm potentially hearing you say is that, so if a parent, for example, is motivated and thinking maybe from a structural standpoint of like the hierarchy of, parents have an influence over their adolescents, that working with them could have an impact on the adolescent, but potentially like working with just a like I'm hearing like the likelihood of a adult struggling with addiction coming in or being motivated to change may not be there. So that's where the family aspect may be more apt to be working with adolescents. Is that
because like think of like kind of like, I don't know, because like I work as like an assistant teacher, so I think of like kind of like a hierarchy of like reward, like there's no reward, like, well, there is a reward to getting clean, I'm not saying that, but like for the person that's going through like the work, maybe they feel like there's no reward coming, as to opposed to like an adolescent where you can kind of show them the future is the reward, and maybe that wouldn't work with an adult. I don't know.
It's interesting. Like I appreciate that perspective. I'm also thinking of, the development of the brain in that, being future oriented, being forward thinking usually happens in your mid-20s. So I'm wondering if that would translate to like a 16-year-old being like, you got your whole future ahead of you. And they're like, I don't even know how to do that. My brain
that is, yeah. Okay, you got a point. Thank you.
Thank you, Sarah. Harley.
I think it's really interesting, the idea of like whether you can work with one person in the system. And we were talking about one of the examples in the book where I forget the details. I think the husband had the addiction, but the wife was the one that was most motivated. So that's who the therapist was working with. And I think in the end, the wife ended up leaving the relationship. And so I think when you ask that question of like, well, can you work with one person or does it have to be everyone? I feel like it depends on like, or it just changes the goals so much of treatment where like,
how so?
because I think if you're working with like one, let's say you're working, the wife is your client, and let's say they come in alone, kind of your goal working together is going to certainly impact the system, but you can't really predict how that's going to impact the person with the addiction. Like they might end up, if the woman decides that her boundary is that she needs to leave, then that could destabilize the person with the addiction and make them worse. Or it could make them better. Like, so, and I shouldn't probably use those words, but make the addiction more intense or less intense. So anyway, whereas I feel like if the whole family is your client, there's sort of, you have more control over seeing how those roles are changing and maybe trying to help everyone deal with the changes in a healthy way.
Sure. So what I'm hearing you say is like having influence, because I would challenge your thought on if the wife, for example, is your client, that doesn't mean that the system also isn't your client. Just because you're working with one aspect of the system doesn't necessarily mean that you have to conceptualize it as an individual. So I would challenge the notion that the outcome would necessarily be different or even maybe the process would likely look different, because again, like you said, I don't really have other perspectives. I'm working with one piece. The thought is that this piece is integral in the system, kind of maybe particularly or in a different way if this person holds a position of influence or power control within the system. But the thought is if one piece changes, there's adjustment. And so the question is, does that have to happen in front of your face, or can that be influenced through one part of the system?
Yeah. And I guess like, I think you're right that you should still conceptualize it from a systems angle, but I do think you're right that the missing piece is like, if you don't have that person in the room and you don't have their perspective, and then later you don't have them talking with you as the changes are happening, it does feel like it would definitely alter the impact of whatever interventions you're doing.
Sure, because ultimately you don't know if the outcome would be exactly the same had you had the whole system in front of you, that the best outcome or the most beneficial, however you want to value it, could be of this person separating themselves from the individual. And I really want to reinforce that in all of you too, because I think many times our thought or like kind of our stereotype around couples work in particular is that a success is when they continue on in their relationship together and they live happily ever after. And that's not our goal. And I'm not saying our goal is to be like, you be single, but ultimately the hope is that you have these two individuals, or, however many people are in the relationship, that they are all feeling like the outcome is best for them. And sometimes that is apart from their partner or partners. So I really want to reinforce that in as many ways as I can, that is not an inherent failure if the system decides to separate as a result of like insight gained through therapy or something like that.
Yeah. Can I just ask a quick question? Sorry.
Yeah, sure.
I totally agree with that. I guess my concern was that it feels like having a lot of change to someone who has an active addiction, if they're not getting support, might be like, to me, I have an assumption that that's bad. But I don't know if that's true.
Say that again. I'm sorry.
I guess I have an assumption that if there's a lot of destabilizing change happening for someone that has an addiction, like a partner leaving them when they're not having active support from a therapist, that feels to me bad.
Yeah. So your hope would be that like or your kind of like ideal situation would be that you would be there as a support as well for that individual. So the worry would be that you are in a supportive role of one part of the system, which may like, you know, move your allegiance toward them or only have access to that individual. And so you're facilitating this change in what's best for this individual and what this individual may believe is best for them and consequently the system. And then you're worried about kind of facilitating harm with someone else with the destabilization or with that change.
Yeah, that would be the concern.
Yeah. And I hope this is this going to sound dismissive? Maybe that's not up to me to decide. So my question in that would be, how do you think it would be different if that change were happening when you have access to that individual? Like how could that be different?
I mean, I guess, like, I feel like the whole process of therapy, that is, I guess it's sort of just the value of therapy and dealing with those kinds of changes. Like, I feel like if the whole system is getting support through changes, you can build new, whatever theory you're speaking from, I guess, but like create new roles and create new support systems, create new narratives that can make the changes feel
Easier, smoother. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And my question would be, you know, I mean, that's a fair, I think that's a very fair concern. And I would, the contextual issue or factors that I would question is, you know, what is the reason that this person is not in therapy? Is the person that you are working with willing to have this individual join? You know, what ways in which can we influence this system for the positive? What might this individual need in terms of support? Because these are all like these kind of confounding factors that we have no support or no control over. But what I'm hearing, Harley, is perhaps one of your values or one of your approaches to this is to have as many people in the room as possible and to maybe not work with, or, you know, I'm maybe jumping here because I'm maybe making some assumptions based on what you've shared, but maybe having the value of having as many people from the system in front of you as possible.
Yeah.
Or like working with one piece just doesn't feel comprehensive enough. It doesn't feel, you know, like you're doing enough.
I don't know, maybe. Thank you.
Yeah, of course. Piola.
So my question with this question is, how would you work with like a family or a couple when the person who's using doesn't think their use is a problem? Like if they don't think like, especially if it's done in like secret and then like the family finds out about it and it's not, they don't think that their use is causing problems for themselves and for the people around them. Do you just like pretty much work with the family so they can differentiate from the user, or you wouldn't want them to differentiate?
Yeah. What do you guys think? So you've got a family coming to you, members, what I'm hearing, whether or not you have access to this family member who's essentially what I'm hearing, like kind of in denial of the effects, the negative consequences of their use, and you have access to other family members. How do you work with that when you've got somebody who's struggling with addiction or seems to be struggling with addiction who says like, it's not a problem?
For me, I would concentrate on trying to get to the bottom of like what the actual issue is and not the actual substance use. Because maybe you'll start seeing a change if they start to work on the trauma first, rather than attacking the person that's using for their use, because then they might become defensive. Or
so you would see what other possible contributing factors there are that substance use is like the way of coping with that.
Just to try to gain like maybe a trust between the family members and that person, because they're already, I'm sure they feel ashamed, I'm sure they feel defensive. So instead of concentrating on the actual substance abuse, kind of working around it until you build the trust, and then, you know.
Sure. Yeah. The only thing that I would say more about what you just shared was to generally the approach is to not go straight for the trauma. Because that can exacerbate use, that can, you've got to establish safety, you've got to establish resources before you move to that, because that's a pretty high order process in that. So I hear you in like, talking kind of around in terms of contributing factors of that. That's an approach for sure. Thank you, Carla. What else? What other thoughts do y'all have?
Well, you could just focus on the other family members that are wanting to change, or like what they can do to change within themselves. I think you said at the beginning of class that in these situations, they can kind of only control their own change, So see what they can do, maybe get involved, like in one of the vignettes, going to Al-Anon and finding their own path. And I feel like the book, read so much, I can't remember for sure, but I think the book was talking about how that change could help create new change also for the addict, and also help support them if the addict does decide to change. Because if the whole family doesn't change, I think it was suggesting that like if the addict decided to change, I think I said this in the beginning, but nobody else in the family did, then that dysfunction could potentially pop up somewhere else. I could have misunderstood that part, but
so the individual who is using changes, but the system doesn't change.
Right.
What did you say would happen?
I thought it said that then like a problem could arise somewhere else within the system.
Oh yeah, definitely.
So yeah, but just if they don't see it as a problem, eventually you would want to probably have the family share like how it is a problem. But I don't know that you necessarily want to start off with that. You probably want to start off with trying to help empower the family to make changes for themselves. And then when the addict is ready to hear, ready to listen, ready to change, maybe then talk about how it's affected the family and what problems they see.
Yeah, thank you for that. So with this Piola, it's like a meeting where everybody's at. So one of the like special skills that we have as an MFT that's a little different than when you're working in individual therapy is what's called creating shared goals. So you are taking these seemingly maybe very disparate agendas, right? So every person in the family, if you were to interview them and say, what's the problem? That they may have very different problem definitions. And if you say, how do we work toward a solution to this problem? That they have very different approaches to that. And then if you say, what are your goals of therapy? That you get, as many different answers as you do the number of people in the room. So one of the things that we kind of do is essentially kind of like in qualitative, what's called a thematic analysis. So you look and you see what's a commonality amongst all of this. Can I help the family create any sort of shared language around what's going on? So if you were to kind of identify the goals, you go for what's considered kind of the lowest hanging fruit, like the one that they're most readily or able to identify as something shared. And then you can implement everything that's been talked about thus far. So the fact is, if you're working with somebody who doesn't see the problem, they're in pre-contemplation, right? And then if you have other people that are in other stages of change, you've got to meet them where they're at. So it might be that you're using different approaches with people, but in my personal opinion, and Camelia, I'm definitely interested to hear if you have a different take on this, is starting with whatever the family can agree on, and moving from there while honoring the potential different agendas. So you can't like insight and somebody enough to say like, don't you see the effects of your use? That's likely what they've been given all the time. So you don't want to give them the same experience in therapy, that you want to validate, you want to empathize, you want to provide these things to the family, that they, just giving them a different experience with one another. So that would be my like very simplistic answer to that, because it's quite a nuance. I really appreciate the situation that you've given, and it's very realistic. Anyone else? Does that make sense to everybody? Of like that, to me, that's one of the cool skills that we have when working with systems, is finding what the commonalities and the language is. So I'm hearing all of you really care deeply about one another, and the hope for you is blah, blah, blah. Framing it in a positive way where the family has likely been pretty volatile and had some contention. So how can I reframe this and then move into some change language or some goal-oriented language? All right, let's take a break. Let's come back together at 8:27. All right, y'all, let's finish strong here for the last 20 minutes of class. So I recognize we are on slide 13 of 29. Please don't fret here. In week 11, we'll be covering motivational interviewing. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take the last 10 slides of this lecture and just move it into that, because I think I only have 11 slides for week 11. So I'll just add this. So don't worry, we'll get to it and it'll make sense. Everything will be very cohesive. It won't just be a carryover. Because next week, Camelia's gonna lead class. So she'll be talking about couples therapy and group therapy. So you guys will get to hear from a different expert and a different voice. So I am going to, what do I want to do right now? I guess because I have all of you in theories, right? I do have a question for you. So on page 127 of the text, the last, or the, 2 paragraphs at the top of the text. I'm just curious what y'all think. So we've talked about integration, eclecticism, and I'm wondering if that's like an overwhelming concept for you, how you feel about that. But the author says, one of my goals in working with graduate students in MFT is to assist them in finding a theoretical foundation. I do not expect them to fully settle on only one until they complete their licensure process, but hopefully when they graduate, they have found a perspective that allows them to conceptualize a case and create a treatment plan that is in keeping with their theory. However, as I consistently remind my students, a theory is not a technique. It is a philosophy of change. Thus, one can have a theoretical perspective while also utilizing techniques from other approaches. For example, a clinician can work from a cognitive behavioral approach and use a genogram to assess patterns within the family system to help to identify core beliefs and schemas. Similarly, a CBT therapist could use the Gestalt technique of the empty chair to assist clients in identifying automatic thoughts. The clinician is not changing their foundational theory of psychotherapy, but using techniques from other approaches. This integration of theory and techniques underscores the ideas presented in this chapter. So curious of any thoughts on that, of having a kind of a foundational theory or a theory of change that is your framework, and then pulling techniques from other approaches that facilitate the goals and are in line with the philosophical stance of that foundational technique or that foundational theory. Does that question even make sense?
I know I was really happy when I read that, because that's kind of my plan. I don't know if that's okay. But no, I have found as we conceptualize different cases, that even this one with the Bowenian, it always amazes me how many of those foundational concepts of enmeshment or differentiation of self, or I find there's certain ones, structural and Bowenian that I find techniques or pieces of it fit, but I don't feel like it would be the overall theory I would use.
Yeah.
So it resonated with me and from that standpoint.
Great. So Julie, don't feel pressure to answer this very concretely right now. So if you think of the approaches or the theories that you've learned thus far, do you have one that you can see yourself like leaning toward in terms of finding a home in that theory of change?
No, I mean, definitely all the postmodern ones have
Sure.
resonated with me more. But I'm still a little bit going back and forth. There are pieces of each of them, like collaborative felt very natural and feminist as well. But then like even just with working with our treatment plan, for example, I didn't feel like it was enough for me to be, it felt like more of an overlay. So I'm still trying to figure that out.
Okay, sure. Yeah, thank you for your honest answer. So Nicole, you said, I feel that the question induces stress for me because I feel so unsure of having like a theory of change and then potentially pulling techniques into that facilitate or that are in line with the philosophical underpinnings of that approach. Yeah.
Yeah, it's similar to Julie. Like I really like a lot of the interventions of different theories, but I also like some of the fundamental premises of certain theories more than others. Like for example, with solution focus, like I really liked, oh sorry, I don't know what.
That's okay.
I really liked the premise of the theory. And then when I practiced it in role play, I was like, this is not for me. Like it was really difficult. I felt like I wasn't getting anywhere. So it's like a mismatch. Like I like the intervention, or I like the intervention, but I don't like the fundamental underpinnings.
Sure.
Like vice versa.
Yeah.
So
it'll take time. I would say that I didn't. So if I can maybe normalize any of this, or hopefully, I don't know. Anyway, let you know that it took me probably until my like third year of my doctorate to be able to articulate that. And I'm still honing it. So I don't want any of you to feel pressure to like be married to anything by the end of your degree. My hope is that you have a curiosity in learning more and that you're not just going by your gut, that it is informed by some theories. There's definite value in having that. But I digress a bit talking about theories. But as you will hear tomorrow in our common factors lecture, that the specific ingredients actually statistically don't really amount to much change. So that's all the mixed messages that you're going to get around the importance of theories as well as the outcomes that we glean from theories. Leanna. Thank you, Nicole.
I also think it's valuable to look at both modern and postmodern theories as two separate entities that you can kind of use one of each. Like, for example, when I'm thinking about theories, I really like Bowen a lot. And I've always really liked Bowen. But then once I saw narrative, I thought that they would be perfect together. So when you think about like generational trauma and how society has kind of added to that trauma and like that way of thinking, I just thought that those two would match perfectly. So even saying that you have to pick one between the two, I feel like they just always go together. Like based off of the ones that I've seen and comparing and contrasting them, the postmodern and the modern generally seem to fit really nicely together. So after reading that, I was also a little relieved, but then I was also like, dang, I would love to use one from each. So I don't know.
Yeah, thank you. So, and again, it's a years and years of process. I don't know, Camille, if you can talk to any of that, of some of your process through your master's and where you're at now in your doctorate.
Yeah, it's definitely really normal to be unsure at this point. It took me a long time. I tried many different theories. And a lot of times you don't really know until you're like working with clients for a while, and then you kind of see like where your tendency is to go or how you conceptualize things. For me, I use EFT. Um, like kind of like only EFT, but I do pull from other theories a lot too. Like I do use a lot of like parts work, like an IFS. I use CBT stuff all the time. Um, but I think once like the theory, I forgot who said this, but they're like, you don't choose your theory chooses you. And so I think like as you go through like the program and you work with clients, you'll find the things that fit with you the best. And if you feel like you are like very integrative, like no one theory fits with you the best, but you like to take parts of different theories, like that works too.
Thank you. So Harley, I really like your question. And if it's okay with all of you, I'm gonna potentially switch gears and show you what I've come up with. So this was actually what I created for my comprehensive exams and my doctorate and have continued to work on since. And quite frankly, one of the slides, I would actually change something today in that. But let me show you. So again, theories of change are very interesting because every single therapist has a different approach to even how they express and share this. So you can see I'm going kind of, pretty traditional, but ultimately, so you can see this from 2018, but I've made some adjustments to it. That's when I did a job talk. I got the job offer, I just didn't take it. So the kind of overarching thought for me is like, what do we want as humans? And then a lot of this is seated, quite frankly, in Brene Brown's work with shame that has history with many other theorists. So she didn't create this. Her research has essentially like cultivated some like a reframing of information that we already have, but just thinking about humans wanting a sense of self-worth, self-validation, love, and belonging. So when I conceptualize humans, especially working in systems, that's really what I think of. But I'll go really quickly through this. And if you guys have any questions or anything, please feel free to ask. So for me, it's seated, the approaches that I use are seated in my beliefs around human nature. So quickly, I believe that we are social beings. We're hardwired to need love and belonging. So all of our actions are functional in wanting, in an attempt to get that empathy and emotions are a point of connection that I've talked about this with all of you in theories of not necessarily having lived experiences necessarily being the space of connection, but the emotions that are evoked through these is where we connect as humans. So that really informs my stance and how I move with my clients. And then really honoring the lived experiences of having that be something that has helped influence who we are, but it doesn't define who we are. And then these are just some quotes. I think context is really important. So I'm really influenced by the ecological perspective. That's essentially, I would say that's the framework that informs all of the models, or that's the framework that informs all of the theories that I work with. And then what do I think humans need to be able to change? So these are all of the things that I try to cultivate in the room, or I have different approaches and I maybe try these things in different ways to see what resonates with the client. An overarching goal for me with anyone that I'm working with is expanding emotional vocabulary. Again, my belief is that we desire connection and that we connect through emotions. increasing an emotional vocabulary and an ability to express that and connect with that is a goal of mine. And then, where I think shame and anxiety play a role. So essentially what I want to do is temper anxiety, figure out how to manage that and eliminate shame, decrease shame as much as possible. Because again, I think that these are barriers to connection. So I don't think that they have a place in the human experience in cultivating the goals that I think that drive humans. And then, I don't know if this is going to sound okay. So this is I'm a big Michigan State fan. This was the starting lineup of the basketball team in 2018. So this is my kind of point guard. So this is, I don't know if any of this makes any sense, but in terms of the theories that I pull from systems perspective, so I would argue that this is largely Bowen. In terms of, I also pull from structural, so looking at these from a systems or modern approaches. Then you can see experiential is also modern. These are essentially the aspects, interventions, the concepts that I use a lot from these 5 different approaches. And then EFT is my go-to with couples and quite frankly with families as well. Again, believing that emotions is the connector. I try to elicit that. And then narrative for me is where I pull in, again, that ecological model of, what are the larger messages and deconstructing that. So these are also these are the theories that I pull interventions from, techniques from. So I largely, but how I really kind of conceptualize is through the ecological model, and I'm feminist informed and common factor. So this is the head coach of the basketball team. This is the assistant coach. So these are essentially like kind of the leaders these are always what is informing my work. And then when necessary, so I do what's called assimilative integration. So I have a overarching framework through socio-ecological model, but I'm feminist informed and common factors. Like these are my foundational approaches. And then I pull techniques and interventions from these 5 primarily. And then also when needed, I use less of these, but I think that they have a place. So these are the 6th, 7th, and 8th man in my lineup of using solution focused psychoeducation and cognitive behavioral. So to me, all of these make sense from a foundation of socio-ecological, feminist informed and common factors, and then interventions and techniques from these 7 or 8 other approaches. So let me see. I think that that's probably I hope that all makes sense. And so if you guys have any feedback for me, but that's how, like, what an assimilative integration looks like, of having a kind of a go-to framework and then pulling from different approaches. Does that answer your question, Harley? No, I'll happily post this. I do need to make a change to one of the slides though, so it won't go up immediately. Does anyone have any questions or comments on that? So remember too, I created this, like this was a more polished version from 2018. I started this process in 2008. That's like 10 years of figuring out what makes sense to me. So you're not expected to come out of a 2-year program and say, I got this, let me make a PowerPoint around this. Any thoughts or questions? I have rendered y'all speechless. It was awesome. Okay, so let's go ahead and end there tonight. Like I said, I will post this to Canvas. We are going to continue this PowerPoint in week 11. It is perfectly aligned. The rest of this really covers motivational interviewing. We're going to be talking more in depth about motivational interviewing in week 11. So hopefully it feels very seamless. If you guys have any questions about this, please feel free. Other than that, I will see y'all tomorrow night.